about you. I'd like to know your point of view. Let me ask what's come off there.
Welcome to my Ransom Notes and the No Radio Show. Today I'm going to talk about codependency. Because codependency is a big term that, of course, we hear all the time. And I think that there are some misunderstandings about what codependency is. Because we actually, what we do is we call the victims of narcissistic abuse, we almost always call them codependents. We almost always do. Sometimes people will call them empaths. Other times they'll use the term targets or survivors or victims. Those are all terms that can be used. It is fair to say that victims of narcissistic abuse are codependent. That is a fair assessment. But what most people don't really think too much about is that the narcissist is also codependent. Because basically what codependency means is it means that there is a unhealthy dependency. So, we're all dependent on one another to some extent. Human beings are, as a rule. I mean, we're social creatures, and we're intended to live in society and have communities and families and all that. So we're intended to be dependent on one another to some degree. But healthy dependency is what is called interdependent, and that's where there is a relationship between grown adult people that is mutually beneficial. Codependency is a dark side. It's the twisted, corrupted side of an interdependent relationship. So rather than being mutually beneficial, it is, some could say it is mutually detrimental, but it certainly is detrimental to one. And in the narcissist would think the narcissist is getting their supply met. So it's beneficial to them if you think meeting their supply, they would think that's a benefit. In terms of their health and well-being, it probably isn't. It probably would be better if they weren't getting it met. So it probably is mutually detrimental. But in their mind, they're getting what they want. They basically are mirror images of one another. They function the same way, but in exactly opposite reflection. Let me just describe what I'm talking about. In the relationship with one another, to get something that combats their pathological fears and phobias. So in contrast to the interdependent relationship, that is for the mutual benefit of themselves and their forward progress as a couple and a family. This is all based around fears and phobias, based on the things that we don't want to have happen. And it's a way of shoring up safeguards against fears. And that's never going to be a positive way to proceed in life, for you to be living with your whole MO as trying to safeguard yourself about what you don't want to have happen. That's never going to be a productive way to live. So that right in and of itself sort of lets you know that we're off to a bad start. So they function very much the same way, only just completely flip-flopped. So, for instance, the person we call the codependent, or the victim, the target of the narcissist, the person with unhealthy narcissism, they have a pretty accurate view of themselves. Usually it's not that bad. They usually don't see themselves as like the worst thing in the world or anything like that. They're fairly accurate about how they see themselves. But they have a huge fantasy built up about their partner, and they actually have an inaccurate view about a lot of people. They view other people sort of inaccurately, so that they themselves by comparison are devalued. But they have a pretty inflated sense of their partner, the person that they are putting their attention into, and the person that they are dependent upon. This works great for the narcissist, who has a inflated sense of himself and sort of a downgraded sense of everybody else. Devalues others and overvalues himself. Very complimentary, if not pretty terrible, for the codependent, who could probably stand to be with someone who would build her up. The narcissist is always seeking narcissistic supply. This is their drug, and they are an addict. They're completely an addict. They're addicted to this drug, and so they need to shore up their supply by being with people that are sure to give it to them. So having someone who overvalues them is great. not only great, but necessary. And, okay, so and with the codependent person, what their issue is, it's not so much that they completely devalue themselves as it is that they have an insecurity about their reality and about their value and about a lot of things. They have a hard time with decision making. They have a hard time with having conviction about themselves especially. So they need to always be checking in. The codependency comes from them both being outwardly focused in that they need feedback from others to tell them who they are and that they're okay. All right, so the codependent is looking for someone to basically tell her that her reality is what she thinks it is. Double checking everything to make sure that they're understanding the world and their place in it correct. The codependent wants to make sure that they are staying in reality. So they're checking their reality against other people. They're saying, this is real, right? As to, being afraid that maybe they're running off a fantasy or they're not seeing things accurately, and this comes from being raised in a narcissistic home where you were denied your feelings, you were denied your reality, where you weren't allowed to express a lot of emotions, you weren't allowed to express anything but what made your parents feel good and what was consistent with the story that your family told. So you got very disassociated from your real feelings and the truth and reality. So you're constantly checking out reality with people around you, and especially with your intimate partner. And so you're not trying to avoid reality. You're trying to make sure that you are in reality. Just the opposite is true for the narcissist. The narcissist is looking to the codependent to confirm their false reality. Okay, so they have a true reality too, and or a true self, and their true self is like a child. Their true self is a cowering child who can't manage the world and is afraid of everything and all that. So they have developed a false self. They have people around to tell them that their false self is real, to tell them that they're pulling it off. That yes, we all see you as the person you want to be seen as. We don't see that true self, that cowering 4-year-old in the corner. We see you as this omniscient, creative, brilliant genius that you want to be. That's who we see you as. And so they keep supply around to make sure that they have that. So this is what the relationship is built on. And they are very tied into whatever story it is that they've created. And of course, I keep thinking of my parents when I think about this. She is, I would say, what I would consider an inverted narcissist, who is codependent because, this is my mother I'm talking about, needs narcissistic supply. But she is basically introverted and not a classical narcissist. And so she had to attach herself to someone who is a classical narcissist, and that's my father. And so that she can get her narcissistic supply sort of vicariously. And over time, I noticed the shift occurred where she got to be more of an equal with him. But I think early on, this was very much how it was. And still very much narcissistic. But recognizing her narcissism was definitely a harder thing to do than recognizing his, because he's this classical overt narcissist. And my mother's qualities are more subtle. As is her codependency. My father's dependency on my mother is also much more profound. It was clear that how he needed her to be the audience. How, because every night he would come home and pontificate to his audience of 1 or 3, my brother and my mother and I. That was kind of an interesting dynamic, but they were very, very codependent, and much of their longevity as a married couple is very related to this, because it would almost be impossible to imagine themselves without one another, because their reality is so intertwined. And when they do things against, like triangulate other people, like make decisions about things that they do when it comes to other people, like me, all of their friends eventually get discarded. Over the course of time, over the course of life, all of their friends have been discarded. Most of them were discarded before I was even old enough to know, but there were a few that I saw it happen. And I never really understood what happened. I just knew that, all of a sudden there was, and basically they happened like around them. They got divorced and started having some troubles with substance abuse and depression and things like that. And those things happened, and my parents discarded them and never looked back. Never looked back and blamed them for it, and that was that. And so I saw this, and of course I never thought that they would do it to me, but on some level I did have some fear about it, because at a subconscious level I knew to not ever need too much, and I knew to play this codependency game with them. I knew my part to play. And also my ex-husband, he knew exactly what to do to win them over, exactly what to do to get them to discard me. And all he had to do was super, super easy. All he had to do was go in and threaten this false reality. Go in and say they couldn't see anything but their fear of that. They couldn't see that they could be being manipulated. They couldn't see that historically that doesn't make any sense. They don't have any evidence of it. They couldn't see past their fear of it, and their belief, I suppose, their projection of their own selves with their lack of empathy and their lack of loyalty and their lack of honesty, that they couldn't probably conceive of really who I even was, and that I wouldn't do that. So they, projected onto me what they were capable of doing and treated me thusly. So when there's a codependent with the narcissist, it's all about they need each other to assuage their fears. So the person we're calling the codependent, which that's kind of confusing right there, is that we label one the codependent when really they're all codependent, because none of these people can operate independently. They're all in relationships because they have a pathological need for what the other person provides in terms of feedback about who they are. But okay, so the victim of the narcissistic abuse, that person, they have a damage from childhood where they need to get consensus. They need to make sure that they're checking their sense of reality against what it's supposed to be. They don't trust themselves, so they check their sense of reality against their environment. And the overt narcissist very much needs the codependent personality person, because their whole way that they can function depends on being able to convince themselves of their false reality, their false self.